Caitlin Ma'aber. Before measuring the 2,000 amas of the city's tchum, we need to establish where the city's borders are. The city's borders are always drawn as a perfect square or rectangle. Now, not necessarily is the city that perfectly squared or that perfectly rectangle. If the borders do not actually have the shape, we adjust them so that they form one of these shapes. This will extend the city's borders, as we'll explain in the Mishnah. So how do we extend the cities beyond their actual borders? That's what Ma'abrin Asarim means. Ma'abrin is Lashon Isha Mu'beres Shekresa Boilet. The Lashon of Ma'abrin is Lashon of being pregnant, of like a woman that's expecting a child. That she's Mu'beres, so she's a little bit larger. So too, Hachika Amar Keted Yesh Le'ibur Le'ir. How do we have it that the city has an extension? And by Nichnas, by Yotzei, because a lot of times they would have one house sticking out further than one house closer into the city. If we're coming to measure where the tchum of the city is, and we're going to measure the 2,000 amas outside of the city, if the wall wasn't smooth, and you have houses that are close by or houses that are attached to the wall, or you have a house that's closer into the city more than the other one, it looks like there's a pigam, looks like there's something, an indent on the outside of the wall, or there's another one protruding. So if a city, if a city does not have a wall around it, but rather its wall is a row of attached houses at the edge of the city, and in one place there's a house that's recessed into the city, and in another place that house juts out beyond it, or if the city has a wall and there's a tower that's recessed into the wall, and there's a tower that juts out beyond the rest of the wall, or if just outside the city there were broken walls of a ruined home that are 10 tvachim high, which would mean that the chorva still has 3 walls or 2 walls and a roof. That's what gedudiyos are. Or bridges or tombstones or tombs in which there's a place for a guard to live. In all these cases, we move the line from which we begin the measurement of the city's tchum out to a point opposite these places. That is, we extend the city's border to an imaginary line that runs from these places parallel to the city across the entire side of the city. This marks the new city border for the purposes of measuring the tchum. If necessary, this is done on all 4 sides of the city. And if a city is shaped like a circle, we make it like a square tablet by drawing imaginary straight lines around it on all 4 sides. These lines are drawn so that they touch the points of the city that are due north, south, east, and west on all 4 sides. So whatever shape the city is, you square it off on the outside and it makes it much bigger. In this case, so that one gains the corners of the square drawn around the city. The tchum is then measured from the edges of the square. The same applies to a city that's shaped like a triangle or has many sides. We draw 4 straight lines passing through the northernmost, southernmost, easternmost, and westernmost points of the city, and we measure the tchum from that imaginary square or rectangle. Mishnah Beis, Nisan Karfeflier. The Mishnah continues to discuss how to determine the city's borders for measuring the tchum. So Nisan Karfeflier, we grant a karfef, which is an open area of 70 2/3 amas. Now we derive this measurement from the size of the chatzor of the Mishkan, as we spoke in Parak Beis. So we grant a karfef to a city that the city's borders are extended to the end of the karfef, to the end of the open area, and we measure the city's tchum from there to Reb Meir. As they talk to Reb Meir, Reb Meir learns this out from a pasuk. The Chacham argue, and they say, the Chacham did not say to add a karfef to a city except to connect 2 cities. That is, if there are 2 cities close to each other. So if we add a karfef of no more than 70 amas and a fraction to this city, and add a karfef of no more than 70 amas and a fraction to that city, these 2 karfefs would meet. Then the karfef added to each city makes the 2 cities like one large city for the purposes of tchum, and obviously you'll be able to walk 2,000 amas from the end of the other city, because the karfef combines the 2 cities into one. According to the Chachamim, this is only the situation where we add 70 2/3 of an amma to a city. Mishnah Gimel. In the previous Mishnah, we learned that we extend the city's borders by 70 and a little bit amas in order to connect it to a neighboring city. The next Mishnah applies the same halacha to connect 3 places by using an additional kula. So too, where we have 3 villages grouped together like a triangle, like a segah. so that the two of them stand opposite each other, with a space in between them, and a third stands some distance away opposite that space. If the space between the two outer villages is such that we were to imagine the entire third village being moved into that space, there'd be no more than 141, and 1/3 amas left between the middle village and either of the outer villages. And the middle village makes the three of them become like one large town for the purposes of measuring the tchum. This is because we consider three villages as if they were standing in a row, with the borders of each village extending 70 and a little bit amas. So if there'd be no more than 141 and 1/3 of an amma between one village and the next, then the borders of each village would reach those of its neighbor. Therefore, they're all considered one town. This kula of imagining that the middle village is directly between the outer ones applies only if the true distance between the middle village and each other is no more than 2,000 amas, since one could travel between any of the outer villages and the middle one without Erev Tchumen, so Chacham were makel and allow the villages to be viewed as if they were standing in a row. And Lamais, at the end of the day, when you're matarif these three cities together, they're all within the tchum of each other, and meaning if we would slide all these three cities to be in a row, and there's not 141 amas between each city, so then you would be able to walk 2,000 amas from each one of these, even from the end of the furthest city. Mishnah Dalet. We measure the tchum only with a 50 amma rope, measuring 50 amas at a time until we reach 2,000 amas. The rope was made of linen, which is strong, it doesn't stretch, and 50 amma rope is pulled very tightly by two people. The measurers had to pull the rope tight with all their strength. So you don't want it to get stretched out, because then it would be more than 50 amas, it wouldn't be measured accurately. It may not be less than 50 amas long, because the shorter rope gets stretched and it becomes longer than it's supposed to be. And it may not be more than 50 amas long, because the longer rope often sags in the middle when it's held by two people. Either way, the measurement will be inaccurate. Each may measure only with the rope held against his chest, so that they both hold it at the same height and not at an angle. If one of the measurers would hold the rope near his head and the other near his feet, the rope would be at an angle, and the distance measured would actually be less than 50 amas in a straight line. The Mishnah assumes that both of these moeded and both of these measurers are of average height, so the rope is not at an angle when the measurers hold it against their chests. If he was measuring and he reached a valley or a pile of stones from a collapsed fence, he measures in a way that absorbs the slopes of the valley or fence, which means that he measures in a straight line across the top of them. If the width of the uneven ground from one side or the other is 50 amas or less, so that a 50 amma rope reaches across it, he measures directly across the top. If the width of the uneven ground varies, and directly opposite the city it is wider than 50 amas, but to one side of the city it narrows to 50 amas, then he may move from the place opposite the city where he's measuring and walk in a straight line to the place off to the side of the city where he can use the rope to measure across the top of the uneven ground. He then continues measuring along that new line, and when he reaches a place which he can walk back in a straight line to the even ground that's directly opposite the city, he returns to his original line of measurement and continues measuring from there. If he reaches a mountain while measuring the tchum, he measures in a way that absorbs the sides of the mountain. That is, he measures over the top of it in a straight line, just as with a pile of stones. And if the hill is such that he has to move and measure from some point that's not opposite the city, he may do so, and he then returns to his original line of measurement. However, wherever the measurer needs to move to an area that's not opposite the city, he may do so only as long as he does not go to the tomb of the city for this purpose, because outside the tomb it's not going to help. It's already outside the city. It's already out of the tomb. If the measurer is unable to absorb the slope made by the uneven ground by using the 50 amma rope, for example, a mountain that narrows to 50 amas only beyond the city's tchum, regarding this case of the Reb Yanai, the son of Reb Yanai, said in the name of Reb Meir, I heard from Irobaim that we make a hole through the mountains, that we measure the mountain in a way that imitates drilling a hole through the bottom of one end of the mountain to the other, with a long measuring rope running through it, and the length of that measurement is the distance that counts towards the tchum, and the slope of the mountain is thus not counted. So you eliminate the measurement of the mountain. The actual measurement is done with the rope that's only 4 amas long. One measurer stands at the foot of the mountain, and the other stands a little higher up the slope. The one lower down holds the rope to his chest, while the other one the one that's standing higher up holds it to his feet. The rope is thereby held in a straight line, and the slope of the mountain is not counted on the measurement of 4 amos. The measurer was on the bottom and climbed somewhat higher up the mountain. Then again, a measure is the same way, repeating this as many times as necessary until they reach the bottom of the mountain on the other side. Measuring a straight line of 4 amos repeatedly is the same as taking a long rope and running it through the bottom of the mountain from one side or the other. This kula is made only with regard to measuring the alpayim amma of Tchum Shabbos, which is only a din derabanan. However, when you have the dinim of the din haTorah, when you have deraisas that are required for, let's say, Ari Miklat and Egla Arufa, this method cannot be used. Mishnah Hey. Measurement of the tchum is accepted only from an expert at measuring land. An expert may measure the tchum. He must be skilled in measuring land and know the halachas of measuring the tchum. Meaning, if you don't have both of them, it's not good enough. The Rav actually says, Adam Abaki b'Medida, a person who's an expert at measuring, the Goin Pirish brings from Goin, Mumcha Loshen Umocha al Kosef Yam Kineres. A mumcha is like is comes from lashon memacha, to smooth out. A baki in something we call him a mumcha is because he already smoothed out all the problems in that area. So over here we're talking about when you have to measure something that has humps and bumps, you want to measure it straight, you want to measure it flat. So memacha means to smooth out. Like when you measure flour, you fill up a cup. So sometimes if you don't flatten out the top of the cup, so then you'll have a lot more than the actual share of the cup. But if you're memacha, that means that you flatten out the top of the cup, so you have the exact measurement of the cup. So that's what ain't made in element mumcha. Interesting pshat for the Rav. B'shem going what mumcha means. If you measure the tchum farther at one point and closer at another point, that is, when you measure the tchum from one corner of the city and measure it again from the opposite corner, one of the markers was further out than the other. We accept the measurements at the point where it came up further, and the tchum for that entire side of the city extends to that point. Likewise, if different people measure the tchum along the same line, and for one of the tchum was further, another one was closer, we accept the further measurement as accurate. The reason for this will be explained in the Mishnah below. Even if a Knani or a Shivcha, who are usually not accepted as Edim, are now meant to say that Tchum Shabbos reaches till here. That is, they are believed to say that a mumcha measurer had marked the end of the Tchum at this point, and that people always walked on Shabbos up to this point. In which case, we can assume that the people who took care of the measuring from the earlier dairas had marked it as the end of the Tchum. However, Avodah may not be the ones to measure the Tchum, since this must be done by experts. The coolest in this Mishnah, because the Chacham did not say when they established the Hilchos Tchumen that in cases of a suffix we have to be machmer ela lahakel, rather we're allowed to be mekel. Since the institution of Tchum is only midrabanon, so the Chacham did not require us to be strict in cases of a suffix or of an eidos. Mishnah Vav. Ir shal yachid v'nasa shal rabbim. The Mishnah briefly moves away from the topic of a city's Tchum and discusses a halacha about shtufei mevois for an entire city. In theory, all the streets in a properly enclosed city, like a city with a wall around it, can be joined in one shtufei mevois, which would be matir carrying anywhere in the city. However, the Chacham were concerned that people seeing this might think that it's mutter to carry even in Rosh Hashanah. The Chacham were therefore geizer that any city or streets might be confused with the Rosh Hashanah must leave some part of the city out of its shtufei mevois, in order that there should still be a malkum where carrying is aser. So you'll remember that there's an issur to carry on Shabbos, and this way people will remember that it's aser to carry on Rosh Hashanah. You have a city that used to be owned by one person and now became the property of many people. You may make an eruv, a shtufei mevois, for the whole city, even though it's now owned by many people. Will not confuse its streets with a Rosh Hashanah, because it began as a city owned by one person, which does not have a Rosh Hashanah. On the other hand, if a city used to be owned by many people and now became the property of one person, its streets might still be thought of as a Rosh Hashanah, since it began as a city that was owned by a rabbin. Therefore, we may not make one eruv for the entire city unless we exclude a certain part of the city from the eruv, whose size is at least that is like that of the town of Chadasha in Yehuda, which has 50 residents. Chadasha was the smallest town in Yehuda. the city right next to it joined in one shituf and excluded chadasha from it, which was enough to be matir, making a shituf for the entire other city. They were Rabbi Yehuda. These are words of Rabbi Yehuda. Interesting. Rabbi Yehuda is saying a halach about the place called Yehuda. It's sufficient to exclude from the Erev area of just 3 chatzeros with 2 houses in each courtyard. Okay, interesting halacha. But weiter, Mishnah Zayin. Misha Hoye b'Mizrach. The Mishnah returns to the sugya of Tchumen, as we learned in Perek Dalet. A person's Tchum is measured from his Malkam Shvisa when Shabbos began, which is ordinarily his home. However, if one places an Erev Tchumen elsewhere, the location where the Erev Tchumen becomes his Malkam Shvisa, and his Tchum is measured from there. In order for a person's Tchum to be measured from his Malkam Shvisa, whether it's his home or his Erev, he must be within 2,000 amos of it at the moment Shabbos begins. So the Mishnah begins with the case of someone who's within 2,000 amos of either his home or his Erev, but not both. Misha Hoye b'Mizrach. Someone was out in the field to the east of his house as Shabbos began. Maybe he was being Makabel Shabbos in the field as the minhag and the time of the Gemara was. And he had told his son before Shabbos, make an Erev for me to the west of the house. Or b'Marav, or he was out in the field to the west of his house. And he had told his son before Shabbos, make an Erev for me to the east of my house. The halacha is like this. If there's 2,000 amos less between him and his house, or more than 2,000 amos between him and his Erev, then he's allowed to use the Tchum of his house. And he's not allowed to use the Tchum of his Erev. Although he wanted to make a Shabbos residence where his son put the Erev for him, he cannot use that place because he was not within 2,000 amos of it when Shabbos began. Since his Erev was no good, we assume that he wants his house, which is within 2,000 amos, to be his place of residence for Shabbos. He therefore receives the Tchum of his house. Now, Le'Ruvay al-Payim Amma. On the other hand, there are 2,000 amos or less between him and his Eruv, and the more than 2,000 amos between him and his house. Also, he's not allowed to use the Tchum of his house, or he's allowed to use the Tchum of his Eruv, because he's within 2,000 amos of it, and that is where he wishes to make his Makim Shvisa. Now, if a person's house is in a city, the entire city is considered his place of Shvisa, and his Tchum is measured from the city's borders. If he makes an Erev Tchum to travel further, he must place it outside the city's Tchum for it to have an effect, and the Mishnah will explain this. So, if one places his Erev in a structure that's in the extension of the city, meaning from anywhere within the 70 amos outside the city, he didn't accomplish anything. His Erev does not have any effect, since that structure is included in the city's borders in any case. If, however, he placed it even 1 amma outside the city's border, even if it's only 1 amma beyond the last structure that's included in the city, then his Erev takes effect as the result of whatever distance he gains in the direction of his Erev, he loses in the opposite direction. Mishnah Ches. Anshe Ir Gedolah Mahalchin is Kol Ir Ketana. The following Mishnah discusses the halacha of 2 cities that are within 2,000 amos of each other, and there's more than 141 amos, so they're not counted as one city. So the Tchum of one city, the large city, contains within it the entire city, the small city, while the Tchum of the second city ends in the middle of the first city. Very interesting case. Okay, let's try to be masbid this a little bit better as we go through the Mishnah. So Anshe Ir Gedolah Mahalchin is Kol Ir Ketana. The residents of a large city may walk through all of the small city that's within the Tchum, and it counts as just 4 of the 2,000 amos in that direction. Accordingly, they may walk in that direction 1,996 amos plus the area of the small city. But the resident of the small city may not walk through all the large city that is only partially within the Tchum. Every amma in the large city counts towards the 2,000 amos in that direction, and therefore they may walk in the large city only to the place where the 2,000 amos ends. If the small city is entirely within the Tchum of the larger one, it's obvious that the people in the large city may walk all the way through it. The Mishnah did not have to say this, so the point of the Mishnah must be that the small city does not count towards the Tchum of the larger city except as 4 amos. For example, if the small city is 500 amos wide, the Tchum of the large city extends to a total of 2,496 amos. Since the entire city is considered the residence of a person spending Shabbos there, the city is equivalent to the 4 amos a person is given when he spends Shabbos out in the open. The Chacham were makel and allowed an entire city to be treated as Talad amos even if he's not spending Shabbos in it, as long as it's within his Tchum. So the Maaseh, he does have an arvacha that he can walk through the whole small city if he's from the large city, and 2,000 amos plus that. Depending where he is. Okay, then how do we do this? This halach we just learned refers to a situation where the residents of each city establish their own city as their makam shvisa. However, in the case where a resident of one city places his erev in the other city, The large city is considered to be just Daled Amos wide, even for the resident of the small city, as the Mishnah will now explain. Kate said, how is this so? If someone who's in a large city and he places Erev in a nearby small city before Shabbos, or if someone who's in a small city and he places Erev in a nearby large city before Shabbos, then the city in which the Erev is located became the place of his residence. He may walk through the entire city, counting it as his place of residence, and an additional 2,000 amos beyond it in every direction. Rabbi Kiva says, if one merely places his Erev in a nearby city, but is not there when Shabbos begins, he's only 2,000 amos from the place of his Erev and not from the city's borders. According to Rabbi Kiva, only someone who's present in the city as Shabbos begins may treat the city as his Daled Amos, but not somebody who merely places his Erev there. I mean, he has to be there, not his Erev there. I mean, Rabbi Kiva is being Memayit in the starkheit, if you will, of how the Erev Tchumen would work. Amalem Rabbi Kiva, the Mishnah test. So the following Mishnah elaborates on this machlekes in the previous Mishnah. So Amalem Rabbi Kiva said to the Chacham, don't you agree with me, that if one places his Erev in a cave, he has only 2,000 amos from the place of his Erev and not from the end of the cave, and he cannot consider the entire cave as 4 amos? Likewise, when he places his Erev in a city, cannot consider the entire city as Daled Amos. When do we agree that one who places his Erev in a cave cannot consider all of it as Daled Amos? Where it's not inhabitable, because its walls have collapsed and it's no longer properly enclosed. In that case, even someone spending Shabbos in the cave cannot consider all of it as 4 amos. And the same holds true if he merely put his Erev there. When the cave is inhabitable, that it is properly enclosed, and he places his Erev in it, then he may walk through the entire cave as if it's 4 amos, and an additional 2,000 amos beyond it, just as if he were in it at the beginning of Shabbos. Likewise, one who places Erev in a city can consider all of it as Daled Amos. It emerges that the inside of the cave, when it's inhabitable, has more of a kula than its top, which is not. For if one places his Erev inside the cave, he can treat all of it as Daled Amos, and he counts his chum from where it ends. But if he puts his Erev on top of the cave, he must count his chum from the place of the Erev. So all these halachas apply to the halacha of if somebody places his Erev in a place where it's not livable or it's not inhabitable. But regarding to one who measures his chum from the place of residence, about the Chachamim said that we give him 2,000 amos from it. We agree that even if his 2,000 amma measurement ends in the middle of an inhabitable cave, his tchum ends right there, and he may not walk further into it. In this case, even the Chachamim agree that an inhabitable cave is not treated as 4 amos. This would be an exact parallel to the case in the previous Mishnah, where the tchum of the small city ended in the middle of a large city. In that case, the residents of the small city do not consider the entire large city as 4 amos, and their tchum ends in the middle of it. Likewise, if a person's 2,000 amos ended in the middle of an inhabitable cave, his tchum ends there in the middle of the cave. Ad kan.